velkommen hertil i hvert fald. Det er jo en stor glæde for os i dag at have Thurston i huset. Vi ved alle sammen, hvor vigtig han er. Så jeg håber, I får en rigtig god aften, og også i Vegas selvfølgelig senere. Så ja, hygge jer, og vi ses.
Hello, hello.
Hi. Thanks for coming to the library. Should I hold this?
Hello. I am Lars Movin, and of course it's also a great pleasure for me to be here tonight. A great honor and very exciting. Yeah, that's good. And I think, I have to say a word of warning in advance. This will not be a session about Sonic Youth. This will be a session about Thurston and New York in the 70s, and we might mention Sonic Youth also, of course. And I guess most of you who are here tonight would agree that for the past 30 years, really, that Sonic Youth has been the most exciting, innovative, original, influential group that has been around, really. And they have published in that time span, they've published like 15, 20 studio records. But that's just the top of the iceberg, really, because around that, the individual members together or separately have been involved in many, many more side projects, collaborations, etc. And it's all a music that, to me, represent something very original, a very distinct music, which is both aggressive and poetic, melodic and noisy, recognizable and new at the same time, and also conceptually very clear most of the time, but still open and with room for improvisation, spontaneity. I will mention briefly, because time is short and we have to get to Thurston as soon as possible, so I'll just mention two things about Sonic Youth that has sort of struck me as a group. And one is that they really are or have been a group in the sense that they sound like a group, they appear like a group. But at the same time, to a much higher degree than any other group I can think of, they have appeared to be four individuals working together in a collective. The other thing that is really interesting about Sonic Youth as a phenomenon is that they have sort of combined the raw energy and power and attitudes of the punk era and new wave and no wave that came out of the 70s and 80s with a sort of a legacy of alternative American cultures from the previous decades. You could basically go all the way back to Dadaism, for that matter, but certainly to the beat generation of the 50s, pop art, minimal art of the 60s, and all sorts of sort of indie culture from all over the place. I was invited here tonight because I wrote this book, which is called Downtown, which is partly about, or it is about, of course, the downtown scene of New York, of which Sonic Youth has been such an important part. And Sonic Youth and its members posed sort of a curious problem to me when I wrote the book, because whenever I got close to that subject, it sort of took over and it became a book about Sonic Youth. Maybe I should have done that instead, but I went a different route. So I chose just to mention them in passing, because what I realized was that the history of New York in that era over the past 30 years, and the history of downtown New York, Lower East Side, in newer times, is really more or less the same as the history of Sonic Youth in many ways. And at the core of all this, of course, has been sound, an exploration of sound textures, most often within the song format, but also in many other ways, more free and transgressive forms. And now we are getting to the point at the core of all that is, of course, the gentleman next to me here, Thurston Moore. And I think, again, we should just give him a very warm welcome. hope you don't mind me mentioning that you were born in 1958, because I'm from 59, so we're almost the same generation. And if I should introduce you, I mean, it would be, there's so many things: a musician, a songwriter, you've been running your own record company, Ecstatic Peace, a writer, artist, many more things. You've been writing, 3 or 4 years ago, Thurston co-wrote this book about the downtowns, or more specifically about the no-wave scene, which was part of downtown. And it's really the most detailed, and it's a highly recommendable book about this subject, with a lot of access to all the key persons and a lot of photos. It's a great book. I should also mention that another part I didn't mention before is that you're a collector. And a couple of years ago in Malmö Kunsthal, there was this great exhibition called Sonic Youth Sensational Fix, which showed that part of your activities. And latest, or last year, I should say, you published a new solo album, and now we're getting really close, which is called Demolished Thoughts, produced by Beck, which is a excellent album. I can't recommend it enough. And that leads me to the first question, because just to sort of get started, we'll go back in time also, but to get started, I would like to ask you just about, what can you're playing later tonight at Vega, and what can we expect later tonight for those of us who are going there? And and in the context of where do you see yourself right now? Where are you going? Are you in a transitional phase, or are you sort of, what's going on right now?
Well, first of all, thank you everybody for showing up here tonight. This was unexpected for me. I wasn't quite sure what I was getting into here. But it's thrilling and nerve-wracking at the same time being here. Tonight, I'm presenting this quartet that I've been sort of playing with for the last year and a half, of musicians from my community. And I've actually given them a band name recently, and we're called Chelsea Light Moving, just because I like giving names to things. I wanted to give the band a name, and we've been touring around just under my name, which I didn't really care for so much, to tour under my name as a solo artist. I don't know why, I just sort of felt like I just didn't want to sort of fall into this genre of like the solo artist who's ex of a band that has some kind of profile like Sonic Youth, and just having this kind of progression from that. It seemed really kind of boring to me. And so I just didn't want to be, Thurston Moore, ex-Sonic Youth, playing in town. I sort of wanted to have a band, because I like the idea of having a band that has a distinction, that has a title, that gives it some kind of sense of, some kind of mysterious aesthetic or whatever. I always thought bands were like gangs in a way, coming into town and showing off their colors and then like leaving in the middle of the night, which is kind of what happens in a way. So I called this band Chelsea Light Moving, and it created some kind of stir in a way, like, oh, Thurston Moore is a new band, blah, blah, blah. This must be really the end of Sonic Youth, which is, it's not the end of anything, and it's really not the beginning of anything. It was just sort of creating something and to see like what would happen. And what happened was basically a lot of conjecture, but all it is a name. And the name Chelsea Light Moving comes from reading an interview with Philip Glass, the minimalist composer of New York City, who in the late 60s, early 70s, Philip Glass, in order to make some money to continue working, doing his musical work, and presenting concerts, which cost money because he had to rent out specific halls in which to play this music. He needed money, and he wasn't really being recognized outside of a very small kind of academic community at the time. He created a moving company, an art moving company. He would rent a van And then he would put a little ad in the newspaper that he was available to move art. And it was called Chelsea Light Moving. And when I saw that, I thought that was a really good name for a band. And it sounded to me like the name of like sort of a British shoegazing band or something, of which we are most we're definitely not that. And so that's what's presented tonight is this band, and I've been playing music from Demolished Thoughts since that record came out, with a violinist and a harpist, both who play on the record, and another acoustic guitarist and a drummer who did not play on the record, but that was sort of the band. And we played that entire record and other material from some solo records I've done, pretty much exclusively acoustically since that record came out. And then I realized that it cost too much money to travel with a full-sized harp. So I had to fire the harpist, which was, I've never had to fire anybody ever in my life before. And so that was kind of rough, but she understood. It was kind of a financial drain. A harp was like 5 more people. And I also was getting really kind of tired of just playing acoustic guitar, because I've been focusing on it for quite a while. And a lot of it had to do with just sort of the fallout of like not playing with Sonic Youth, which was such a amped up band, that I wanted to play music that sort of was more investigations into acoustic guitar music. But I kind of sort of hit the wall with it a little bit. So with this band, I'm kind of getting rid of the acoustic guitars, and I'm writing songs with this band. And we've been putting them up for free online on the record label site, Matador Records, and also our own little sites that we have. And they're free. And we've put up 4 songs so far. One song is called Burroughs, which is a song about William S. Burroughs' last words before he died, where he was ruminating on the emotion of love. And for William S. Burroughs to talk about love is a fascinating thing to begin with, and those were his last words. And I can only paraphrase what those last words. I think William Burroughs, you should know this since you did a film and a book on William S. Burroughs, but his last words were what? Please tell us.
Love, the only natural painkiller what there is.
Love is the only natural painkiller that there is.
Yeah, he miswrote that for what?
Something to that effect. That was his last words. So this song was inspired by that. And then there's 3 other songs. That's what's being presented tonight. It's sort of half acoustic, half electric. As far as it having any sort of establishing anything, it's really no different than when I was in my early 20s in New York and wanting to be in a band and starting a band. The ambitions are really not that much different, because there really is no ambition beyond from getting from one day to the next. And I've always sort of liked working in that situation where it's not such a planned expedition of work, knowing that you are going to work. And the only difference now is that I have much more of this kind of, it's a bit more gracious now, because people recognize the work from its history. That's the only difference, is that at first there was no history. So, but it hasn't changed in too much degree.
Okay. Then we go, you mentioned your early 30s, we can go early 20s, we can go even further back, we can go 40 years back, because on your previous solo album, Trees Outside the Academy, that came out in 2007, there's a curious track at the very end of the record called Thurston at 13. And can you, basically what it is, I guess, is you at 13 dropping some objects on a table, recording the sound and naming the objects. And that's a very advanced Fluxus piece. So were you in a very advanced kid at that time, or did you have any awareness of
Well,
avant-garde art?
I think Fluxus always sort of had the desire to be innocent, and I think that's sort of what you're saying. But 13 would have been 1972, maybe. I think I was 10 years old in 1968. Yeah, I had a tape recorder, and I was just experimenting with the sound of the tape recorder, and I found that cassette tape, in my mother's house at some point a few years back, and I was listening to it, and it was just me at 13 years old, dropping objects on my desk in my little bedroom, like a coin or a pencil or a rubber band, something that wouldn't make sound, and saying that's the sound of this, and there is no sound. And I don't think at the time I realized that like someday I will use this on a solo record in my 40s. But as it turns out, I did.
A few years later, I mean, like many New Yorkers, you are not born in New York. As far as I know, you were born in Florida, but you grew up in Connecticut. Is that right?
Yeah, I was born in Coral Gables, Florida.
Yeah.
My father was a university professor at University of Miami. He taught art history and music, philosophy, and he found a slightly better paying job up in Connecticut, which is just outside of New York City. And so my teenage years, my growing years were in New England and in Connecticut. Yeah. And it gave me access to New York City. It was maybe an hour and a half drive from where I lived. And so by the time I got to be of age, and I was always reading about music and rock and roll, and it was kind of an interesting period in the early 70s because you started having much more sort of kind of academic writing about rock and roll as a serious art, as an art music, and not only with writers who were coming out of more of a gonzo style of writing, but like Richard Meltzer or Lester Bangs, and magazines that sort of would employ these people, or they would create like Cream magazine out of Detroit, Michigan, but also like Rolling Stone magazine early on was using these writers. But then you had more disparate, marginalized writers like Patti Smith before she was a recording artist. She was sort of filing record reviews and doing stories, and they were really interesting to me because they stood apart from the typical academic take on the music, and it was a more emotional take, and it was also a take equating the music with the beauty of like Renaissance art or something. And so that was really interesting to me, was like, let's make rock and roll a high art. And so that was a very, for me, like completely inspiring and completely intriguing as a teenager to see this. And I realized that I was somewhat alone in my community, seeing these signals and these, specifically in these kind of underground rock and roll magazines, and knowing that a lot of the activity and a lot of the information was coming out of New York City, which was near enough to where I lived, was fortuitous. I don't know what would have happened if I had lived even 100 miles further or whatever. I don't know. But as it were, it was such I found it so alluring that I really wanted to go and see these people, what they looked like, because I would see pictures of the band Television or the band the Ramones or whatever when they first started, and there's these. And Patti Smith filed the very first journalist piece on Television in a magazine called Rock Scene, and and the title of it was a Bob Dylan quote, "Where somewhere somebody must stand naked," and it was like this band called Television, and just the fact that a band had a name like that, which was this very sort of this kind of banal name of an object that's in your household, was completely unusual. And the fact that this band had short hair was was really unusual. There's nobody had short hair who played rock and roll at that time. So the idea of walking into a club and seeing a band on stage with their hair short was completely startling and shocking. It was just like, how can that be?
You have an essay somewhere. You wrote an essay where we have some reflections on the fact that the importance of context, that it really meant something different to see those groups in New York when you finally got to go there and see them yourself in the New York clubs, as opposed to seeing them when you were sort of touring and playing out in other venues around the country. Can you sort of expand a little bit
on that?
Well,
certainly, New York City was in its penultimate phase of being a very impoverished place, a very impoverished city on the American landscape. It was not until the 80s when there was when money actually sort of came into New York and they started to rebuild it as an economic kind of force. Before that, it was denied any funding, like just flat out, by the administration at the time, which was the president at the time. His name was Gerald Ford, and he flat out denied New York City any support and money. And at that point, the city just tanked, and it became a kind of a Wild West zone of poverty and of course crime, and it was a mess. But it was sort of the end of this period of New York where any young person could go there and live for nothing, and it really was. You were able to go there and sort of, live for pennies per day. And in the No Wave book is really some funny interviews with Lydia Lunch, where she talks about how her schemes of getting from like one moment to the next, and if she could make $10 in 1 week, she was set. And so she would do routines like pretending she was blind or something with a cup or whatever, something, just enough to make some money. And and she would live for free in a building by telling the landlord that, since the building was so run down, that if she lived there, she could protect the building from other people living there and ruining it. And he was like, okay, sure. That was the end of that era of being able to do those kind of scams in New York and live in such a way. And that's right when I entered into there. I moved to New York in early '77, and I had begun to go see bands and such at places like CBGB and Max's Kansas City, and there's a few other places in '76.
You actually went to see Suicide at Max's Kansas City, isn't that right?
Suicide was the first thing I saw. And it had nothing to do with going to see Suicide. It had everything to do with going to New York and wanting to go to one of those clubs and I wanted to go to CBGB, but I had no idea where it was. And I knew Max's Kansas City was on Park Avenue somewhere, and I basically drove into New York with a friend of mine, and we just yelled out the window, said, "Where's Park Avenue?" Park Avenue runs the entire gamut of the island just about. So it was just by happenstance that we hit it, and we started looking at addresses, and we zigzagged. I mean, this was like an 8-hour ordeal, which should have only taken 45 minutes. And there it was, and we parked the car, and we went into this place, and it was like 6 p.m., and so the bands didn't really start until like 11 p.m., and we basically just sat there and drinking Coca-Cola the whole time. That's all we could really afford, but we were just so electrified that we were actually in this place, because we knew about the history of the place. We knew that it had this legendary back room where Andy Warhol would and the factory habitués would sort of hang out, because the factory was nearby at that time before it had moved uptown. And so there's all this history that we somewhat knew about. We were basically we were just in our late teens. And we went upstairs to see the music, and the band that was playing was called Suicide, and the other band was called The Cramps. And The Cramps had just shown up from Cleveland. It was like one of their first shows in New York. And they were the first band on. And people just kind of, the people there, I remember, were just sort of like New York's sort of, sophisticates in a way, and we were just kids. And I remember they kind of just sort of laughed amusingly at the Cramps, and the Cramps were coming out and doing like garage rock songs, which was very strange because there was no culture of that at that time, of actually sort of a band referencing 60s underground garage rock singles. There was just, the only document of that era was a double album that Lenny Kaye had put out in 1972 called Nuggets, and in a way that was the only documentation historically of that era for people. So it was very sort of arcane. But here was this band actually sort of going further into that catalog and like presenting themselves, and they were completely bizarro, as you can well imagine. And I was just fascinated by them. And then Suicide, I thought, was going to be sort of like a really sort of tough New York hard rock band coming out and like playing like the Dictators or something. And what it was two maniacs, one guy on like, it was, completely maniacal. I mean, there's a guy, Martin Rev on the synthesizer at just like just airplane volume, and then Alan Vega. And it was a small club. And Alan Vega would just basically, he had an old lady's wig on and white paint smeared on his face and scars that were sort of, I don't know if they were real or not. And he was completely demonic and very confrontational, to the point where he was coming out on the tables and wrapping his microphone cord around, like females' necks and pulling them and then grabbing their hair and screaming in their faces with tons of reverb on his voice. And I'd seen some bands before. I saw Jay Giles' band and I saw Peter Frampton, but I never saw this. And I don't think we lasted the whole gig. We got really, really frightened. And at some point, I think when he picked up his glass or he picked up somebody's glass off a table and broke it and started like slightly carving his chest, and then like pushing people's faces into his chest. We kind of like, we crawled out because a lot of people in the front had upended their tables to protect themselves from this guy. And so we crawled out of there and we drove home and we were silent. But at some point, we were just sort of like, what just happened? And it was like, we have to go back. It was like we had to go back to sort of see like, what was that?
And you have actually moved back the year after, or quite soon after, beginning of 77. So did you move directly into the East Village, or did you sort of...
I did. I got out of school, and I did like maybe about 2 months of university. And at the time, I just kept going. I mean, I was really just going back and forth so much, and I decided that I wanted to move there and play music. And I was able to do this by meeting some people who were graduates of the Rhode Island School of Design, who I had met surreptitiously. And I started writing back and forth with them through the mail, which was the only real communication at that time. And they had said they had graduated and were moving to New York City to start a band and do art, et cetera, et cetera. And they were the graduating class right after the Talking Heads, David Byrne, and they asked me if I wanted to come in and play music with them because of our communication, because we knew the same stuff. Like we were like talking about like Velvet Underground or Flamin' Groovies and these bands like that. And that was a very interesting thing. It was almost like there was like one person in each town at that time that sort of with this kind of new music would resonate with. And the music was very sort of retaliant and nihilist in a way, as far as like what it was coming out of. It was really wanting to sort of like, it was all about kind of repudiating what rock and roll had become at the time, which was very sort of overblown in a lot of respects, or it was extremely distasteful and unapproachable as far as disco was concerned, which was sort of this cocaine dance culture. So a lot of it had to do with this idea of rock and roll being equitable to like money. And so the fact that we had no money or we had no interest in money, we sort of wanted to it was like the idea that you had somebody like Patti Smith coming out and saying the same thing, like we created it, let's take it over, wanting to reclaim this idea of rock and roll as a sort of a people's adventure, as opposed to Emerson, Lake and Palmer or whatever, or the idea of the rural, which was like sort of completely prevalent in the music, the Allman Brothers Band, and the idea, or even Bob Dylan living in Woodstock, and the whole thing of Woodstock as a culture. It was always this sort of romance with the rural and living out in the country and having this cool sort of commune kind of vibe. Whereas, in a way, the Ramones and Patti Smith were embracing the urban. And the urban was never really cool in the '60s. It wasn't not cool to be from the city. It was it was a little kind of it was definitely this kind of odd duck thing to be. So when you'd see things in the '60s like MC5 or the Stooges, they were really they were very unpopular. I think there were certain rock critics who were very fascinated and would write about this, but it was not a popular form of music. Popular form of music was Joni Mitchell or James Taylor. It was the sound of the country. It was just the idea of getting away from the urban. Patti Smith and the Ramones embraced the urban and presented the urban as this kind of new romantic idea, and so that's where my age group came into. And I think there was like one or two people in each sort of zone that would sort of respond to this, and so when we all sort of came to New York in the mid-'70s, heeding like this information, we all met each other, and everybody had the same story. I was the only one in my town. Even when I would meet somebody from Australia, like Jim Thirlwell, J.G. Thirlwell, Fetus, living in Melbourne or whatever, and he's like, I was the only one. There was only one band, and that was the birthday party, and blah, blah, blah. It's like this kind of stuff. So it was definitely this sort of this kind of roundup of kind of people who resonated with this sort of kind of new alien kind of feeling in their culture. I think that had a lot to do with it.
When you go to New York today and you go into East Village, I guess it looks completely, the Lower East Side looks very, very different from what it looked back then. If we take a film like Jim Jarmusch's first film, Permanent Vacation, the shots he has of New York in the late 70s, it looks like Beirut or something. It looks like sort of this war zone or something. How bad was it to be at the Lower East Side?
It was just poverty. There was no money in the city, and there were in a lot of the ideas of sort of building housing for low income. It was not. It lost any support it had. It had lost from like the late '60s onward. So it became these disaster zones. It took a lot of politicizing through the years for that city to sort of rebuild, for better or worse. And the way it was not really sort of dealt with in any liberal way. It was dealt with in a very sort of very capitalist way, where real estate became sort of like the leading force of change, and invariably it kind of displaced a lot of low-income families. They got sort of swept away into God knows where. It doesn't. Just more sort of outer regions. So New York City, Manhattan, the island of Manhattan became, for the last 20 years or so, it's become it's become a moneyed place to live, and it's sort of like I said, it was that era from like 77 to 87 is sort of the last era of the 20th century of New York City as being a place where you could go and be an artist and work without having the anxiety of too much anxiety about making money to sort of make ends meet, or that doesn't exist anymore. But that said, it's like New York City has always been about change anyway, historically. So, I mean, if you accept that fact, I think people who want to sort of work as artists and not have to sort of have to make so much income to support that, they find ways of doing it, and they know that New York sort of has this really this intensified history of that's really soulful. It's really deep. It's very real. That there's other outlying boroughs to New York City, such as Brooklyn, such as Queens, such as the Bronx, such as Harlem. Harlem's upper Manhattan. But primarily right now in contemporary time, it's Brooklyn, and Brooklyn is a huge landmass. It's about 20 Manhattans, and it's become really exciting and for a lot of young people because they can actually find places to stay, find places to live fairly reasonably. I mean, but it's like, again, it's difficult because I think once there's any sort of prevalence of lifestyle that can be commodified, through capitalist culture, it gets bought into really quickly. And so even like Brooklyn now has become sort of this kind of hotspot of money. But it's interesting to me to watch, having sort of lived through the years, those last years of Manhattan, of how young people come to New York who have really no money, how they sort of make do, and they just go further and further and out. And in a way, New York is not so necessary as a cultural center anymore, as anywhere could be necessary as a cultural center. Now that we all sort of can sort of connect pretty much just through the development of interconnectivity in our time. So the fact that the library is completely accessible to just about anybody, anywhere, at any time. That's the biggest change in our lifetimes.
Are you as hot out there as we are up here?
Hot?
Hot.
Oh, are you hot?
I'm hot. I'm hot. Aren't you hot? Let's move right on to sort of what sort of impulses inspired you as an artist in that certain time and place, which we call the downtown scene. I mean, you moved to New York. You started playing in this band. Was it the Coachmen or something? Yeah. But then you moved on to, I mean, at that scene you've been talking about, basically around Lower East Side. I mean, you moved on to. I mean, there were many other people around doing different things. There was, of course, the rock and CBGBs and No Wave and all that. But there were also other people like Glenn Branca and Rhys Chatham, and as I told you before the show, the last person to sit in that chair was Tony Conrad, which was sort of the generation before the minimal composers of the 60s. So there was a whole tradition there, which you picked up on, which has sort of made you as a musician, and also is part of why you are quite special in the sort of rock context, because you picked up on those impulses. Can you talk about the beginning of that? What really got you interested and turned you on to your approach to guitar playing?
Well, there was no standard of success. Mm-hmm. So the idea of moving to New York to play music, there was no formula for success. There was, you didn't really look at the New York Dolls as being successful. You looked at them as being like completely great. But the New York Dolls sold no records. The only people who bought New York Dolls records were like just completely ultra marginalized freaks. They weren't a success story, but they certainly made they cut quite a figure, and that's what I think people like us were interested in. So I think the idea was not being interested in making money. That was not the idea of going to New York to be an artist. It was to make it in any way that has anything to do with making money. It was just sort of actually just wanting to be in the lifestyle of the artist in the city. And I think that changed quite a bit. I think it changed a lot for my generation, or at least in the generations that came after me, with certainly the success of something like Nirvana. When Nirvana became such a success in the early '90s, that really kind of changed the psychology, I think, of a lot of like young people wanting to sort of kind of work in a discipline that was primarily underground, which was, you know, avant-garde, punk rock, et cetera, et cetera. And that always sort of concerned me a little bit. But I still see a lot of activity happening in the underground that sort of still does not sort of cater to that kind of desire. And certainly, I don't think Nirvana catered to that desire. They just sort of won the lottery on that, and for good reason, because they were fantastic, and you know, it made sense in a lot of ways. But what led me there was just I have to say a lot of it has to do with I was very young at the time, so I don't want to sort of overstate like some kind of idea of moving to the city to want to sort of be part of this lineage that sort of was, be it sort of Warhol in the art world, or it be like Allen Ginsberg and William Burroughs in the world of literature, or even in the world of experimental film with like Stan Brakhage and Jonas Mekas, and that stuff was there, and it was apparent. But I think at that young an age, it was definitely this melange, and this idea of thinking about working multidisciplinary in a way, such as, the whole idea of being an artist in the way that John Cage presented it, and being multimedia, being multidisciplinary. I mean, that wasn't really an intellectual concern. It was already something that was established because of somebody like John Cage. So the idea that was established in the culture, we were able to sort of be liberated, and that was, I think later on when I started studying the life of somebody like John Cage or Merce Cunningham, it was just like you became very thankful for people like this who allowed the culture to exist for like our generation to come into, and sort of not have to sort of struggle to sort of make that valid. It was already validated. And so I think a lot of the new ideas that were happening in punk rock were ideas that were already somewhat established in other disciplines. And I think that was sort of, Raymond Pettibone always sort of laughs about punk rock, because he was like, oh, punk rock always thought it was doing something new. And it was not true. But it was new, because it was new. It was new for us. It was new for them. And so I think the idea for me was like moving to New York was just to do more investigation of Joey Ramone, because for me to see a lead singer in a rock and roll band who was like 6'8", like taller than I was, and was stooped over with like this kind of stringy hair and these like beady little glasses and this like too short leather jacket and over ripped jeans was really beautiful, and it was like so striking, and it just like it touched my heart in a way that like Robert Plant could never do. So I think that's what kind of led me to New York.
But things were, I guess you must have been hit with sort of a million impulses when you actually got to New York. So many things happening, and things were happening very fast. I love this quote you wrote somewhere that I moved to New York, and now I'm quoting, I moved to New York to fuck Patti Smith. And now Lydia Lunch was saying that Patti was most definitely uncool. So it's just...
You're reading the unedited copy there.
But things were...
Actually, we moved her to Mary Patti Smith. That was.
Okay.
I think that's what we changed it. I don't know.
Right. But anyway, what I'm saying is that you were sort of right before moving to New York. You were interested in that scene that was sort of evolving
well, when I
around
moved there,
CBGBs,
everybody it was kind of an older than me. I was young.
Yeah.
And the people I moved there to play music with were already a bit older than I was coming out of university. And so I was kind of the young guy, and I was really interested in like wanting to sort of play in the style of like Dee Dee Ramone, but I wanted to sort of also kind of have the same sort of sensibility as far as appreciation for like the history of art that somebody like Patti Smith would have, or that you would see even like this coming out of literature, the way Richard Hell was coming out of the St. Mark's Poetry Project and all this. And so these were the things that I wanted to sort of work with. And it was funny because I was kind of taken aback by a lot of what was going on in the art world at the time, because I didn't realize what the art world was in New York. And all of a sudden, I was living amongst it, and it was kind of a crash course in this kind of, there was a bit of a snob aesthetic going on like that. And it was sort of it was very anti-rock. And in a way, punk rock was very rock and roll with Johnny Thunders and even the Ramones. And so there was this idea of just like, well, punk rock is still rock and roll. We're going to completely divorce ourselves from any traditional aspect of rock and roll. And so you had bands like Teenage Jesus and the Jerks appearing. And that was really, really surprising to me, because I would see these people who were my age, like in the streets of the Lower East Side, East Village, specifically somebody like Lydia Lunch, who I would see around. She lived in my neighborhood, and I didn't know her, but I knew she was kind of trouble. And then all of a sudden, she sort of had this band, and she was, appearing on stage, topless except for like, black electric tape over her nipples and singing songs. And I was just like, okay, this is not Patti Smith.
Right.
And not only was it not Patti Smith, but it was somebody who was actually sort of writing such sort of scabrous and angry music, and also just attacking the scene at CBGB's, which was Patti Smith, as coming out of hippie, which was kind of true. I mean, Patti Smith sort of came out of a hippie era, as did Richard Hell and Tom Verlaine. They came out of the early 70s and late 60s. They came to New York in the late 60s, and they sort of developed this kind of new austerity and this idea of making music that was referencing, like a French New Wave cinema or whatever. That was all fascinating, but all of a sudden you had this hard line being drawn by these people who were my age, attacking the people that I came to New York to sort of associate with, which were kind of older people, and I kind of got it at first. I mean, it was kind of an affront to me, and but I didn't really know if I liked it until I started going to see some of these bands and realizing that they were far more sort of radical than what I was seeing with the so-called old guard. It's weird because this book No Wave was called Post-Punk Underground New York, etc. But the idea that it's only post-punk in retrospect, because it's interesting. A lot of the bands, when you think about like Teenage Jesus and the Jerks or the Contortions or Mars, they all started in like late 76 and 77. They started they were kind of at the same time as Blondie, but they were half generation younger, and they were far more sort of wanting to sort of make a point of being kind of aggressive, and definitely nihilist in the face of kind of hippie fallout and post-Vietnam, the Carpenters kind of,
also more radical in a musical sense in many ways. I mean,
because it was decidedly anti-musical. Yeah. It was just like, I mean, in a way, it was more equitable to, like, say something like the Sex Pistols were saying in London. Even though the Sex Pistols were playing Chuck Berry riffs, they were saying, we don't care about music. We're in it for the chaos, And so those kind of statements, in a way, were very important, I think, to us.
And musically, there were from the no wave generation. There were a guitar player like Arthur Lindsay, if you can call him a guitar player. I mean, I guess you can, of course. He's playing the guitar, but in a very radical way. There was a lot of like deconstruction going on and anti-music, as you say. I mean, but what sort of impulses did you pick up on that sort of sent you in a direction that was interesting for yourself?
I think the idea of creating a personalized language with your instrument, like this kind of like self-invention, was just sort of was a matter of that was a decision to be made. Like, is that something that you wanted to sort of regard, the idea of playing guitar in complete rejection of tradition? Or did you want to become like a technical musician as such? I was not a very good guitar player to begin with. I think I probably could have been if I really studied, and I really sort of took guitar lessons. I think, I don't think I would have had too much of a problem with it. But I wasn't really interested in progressing that way. I didn't really want to sort of learn how to play, Ravel's Bolero or anything on guitar. I just was not interested. I had no interest in proficient electric guitarists like Duane Allman or Eric Clapton or what have you. I mean, I thought they were kind of great, but I didn't really foresee myself woodshedding to get to that point. I really had this idea of immediacy being important. In fact, the first thing that attracted me to punk rock was the idea of immediacy and this spontaneous kind of songwriting. But still, these guys could play guitar. Johnny Thunders knew how to play guitar in a certain way. And I had the rudiments down. But I think as soon as I started seeing musicians in New York, such as Glenn Branca, who was coming out of theater and just sort of applying it to this approach to guitar, and the idea of restringing a guitar so it's just like mass tuning, a mass note, one note on one guitar on 12 guitars, and just these ideas, or seeing Lydia just sort of playing slide guitar in one very singular way, which was a very effective way of playing, and having this very sort of direct approach to what she wanted to do, which was just like this one snare drum and this snare guitar, and then it's like these like three notes on a bass and variants of it. That to me was more inspiring than seeing some kind of like more traditional rock and roll band. Even like the Patti Smith Band was a very traditional rock and roll band in a way. And television was just like these were two lead guitarists interweaving with each other in a very beautiful way, and it was very. The sound of it was very evocative of what it felt like living in New York at the time. But I didn't really feel like I want to sort of become that kind of player. I wanted to do something a bit more that felt kind of more genuine to my own condition as a young person in New York. And so the idea of people just creating music like Arto Lindsay, where he had a 12-string guitar and he was just kind of like playing it very, just completely expressionistically in a way. I mean, there was no real notation going on there. He played the same way almost on every DNA song. He was just kind of playing the same way.
No tuning.
No tuning. It was just like the way he would sort of just hit the strings. It was just sort of this idea. It was just this kind of like action rhythm. That to me is where I wanted to go in a way. And so. I don't know. I think Sonic Youth started out that way, but we were all sort of kind of non-musicians. I mean, Kim sort of came out of an art world and just learned how to play bass by patterns, and she was interested in patterns. So this is like, well, just that's how you will learn, is like through patterns. And I just wanted to sort of explode everywhere. And Lee knew how to play pretty much. I mean, Lee used to study Grateful Dead records in college, so he kind of knew that stuff. And the first drummers we used didn't know how to play drums. I mean, they just wanted to play in bands, and that was kind of, there was something very sort of very hip about that, of having musicians that weren't musicians, because in a way that music was better because it was definitely more dangerous and more new, and it was more of an affront to the hierarchy of rock and roll music, which we all wanted to sort of dismantle, you know.
I should insert a footnote here. I mean, having said that, I mean, concerning what you just said about yourself as a musician, we should also know that in 2004, I think, Rolling Stone magazine made a list of the 100 greatest guitar players of all time, and you're number 34. So, I mean, it's not, you didn't do that bad. And,
well, it's funny because I was on the cover of Guitar Player magazine, you know, this technical magazine for guitar players, like in the 90s. And it was just like, you know, it was like special like grunge guitar issue or something. And they put me on the cover. And I was recording with Richard Hell at the time. And he brought in Robert Quine, who was the guitar player in Richard Hell and the Voidoids. And Robert Quine was a fantastic guitar player. He could fantastic jazz guitarist, blues guitarist, but he played in Richard Hell and the Voidoids, and he just made that band wonderful. And but this guy could really play. He knew how to play guitar, and he was really sort of outside, and but he could also play really inside. And he came into the studio to sort of play a song with us, and he saw the Guitar Player magazine with me on the cover, and he was like, and he didn't really know me so much. He didn't, you know, he probably heard of Sonic Youth, but I don't think he cared so much. And he was like, "Wow!" He goes, "That's amazing." He goes, "I would love to be on the cover of Guitar Player magazine." It's like that's incredible. It's an honor. I was like, "Oh yeah, you know, whatever." And then we had it sort of. He wanted us to play this old blues song called Natchez Blues, and we're like, "Okay, yeah, you know." And we were doing this project called Dim Stars with Richard Hell, and I kind of know how to play, you know, from an E to an A to a G, and I can do some blues boogie riff. I can do that, and but somebody passed around a joint, and I took a couple of hits, and I don't really smoke that much marijuana, but I took a couple of hits, and I got completely like dumbfounded. And we went in to record, and I was sitting across from Quine, and I couldn't move my hands. And he was looking at me. He's like, it's like the easiest blues move ever. I mean, anybody, like my mother can play this. And I was just like, I gave up after a while. And he was just like looking at me. And then the next day, we got back in the studio. And I said, man, I told Richard Hell, I was like, I was so embarrassed that Quine was here, my guitar hero, and I was like too stoned to play. And he's like, yeah, he was wondering about like how could you be on the cover of Guitar Player magazine, and you couldn't even play the like simplest like chords. He's still kind of concerned about this, and he's like he's going to write a letter to the editor, and I was just like, no, I was stoned. He thought I was submental or something. You know?
You've been mentioning Patti Smith a number of times, and you also actually did a very great interview with her at one point, a great conversation. But one of the things I think which is special about Patti Smith, that throughout her whole career, and even now when she's considered to be a big icon in her own right, I mean, she remained a fan. And how did you, I mean, what has your thoughts been about the whole fan culture and the sort of being a star and having fans and being a fan yourself and all that, how to handle that?
Well, I don't know what to say about that. To me, there's certain boundary issues involved with this kind of stuff. I'm completely smitten with people whose work I admire, you know, and I kind of like I find it really easy to like completely fall in love with anybody who's doing work that sort of touches me. But I don't really have any sort of unrealistic kind of fantasies about it. But it's just like you do want to. It is nice to sort of be in this same room as these people. I think that's definitely something I never really foresaw when I moved to New York and started playing music, that I eventually would sort of interact with somebody like Patti Smith or Iggy Pop or Tom Verlaine or Richard Hell or even like William Burroughs, or Allen Ginsberg. I mean, this stuff just sort of happened as it happened, and each time that does happen to me, I never really sort of, I don't think of myself sort of being like almost on the same planet as a lot of these people. I feel like I'm very starstruck, but
I guess another reason why I'm asking this is also that in Sonic Youth especially, you've had this way of sort of connecting your music or presenting your music in the context of, for instance, visual artists, like having artwork on the covers. And
I think our interest was always in community, and in a way I feel like that kind of balances a lot of distance and separation from people, where you kind of have this sort of sovereignty as the artist, and then there's everybody else. And I never liked that. And the one thing I really that really impressed me at first with the idea of punk rock was that it was sort of a people's music, and it was like you could have a drink at the bar and then go on stage and be in a band. I thought that was I liked that a lot. And I also liked the idea of interdisciplinary work, when I would, the idea of like Cage Cunningham, et cetera. That was really important to me, and I really liked the idea of the various artist compilation records early on, especially in the early 80s, and that to me, that was my one desire to be in a band. I wanted to be on these records with other bands. I didn't want to be sort of I wasn't really interested in so much being a singular force as being part of more of a larger community of ideas and this kind of this sharing of language. And I thought that was really important in a way, and I thought there was a certain power in numbers politically that way, as far as commentary. And so I enjoy the idea of festivals. Like, I like playing festivals, even though they're kind of a drag because there's no sound check, and you kind of suck when you go out and play these things. But I like that idea, and I sort of to me it was like with Sonic Youth, it was all about learning about different cities and different countries on tour, and finding out the different bands and the different music and the different artists. And especially in the punk rock scene, it was always like there was such a crossover into the art world, and that was really important to us. And so a show like Sensational Fix is just it's just our history of that kind of interactivity with the art world and with film, people doing film.
But has it also been sort of a way of pointing to certain? Yeah.
Just a second. First, your taxi will be here in 10 minutes, so we need to...
Okay. I know, I'm wrapping up. Yeah, we have 5 minutes left, sorry. But I just has this follow-up question about, if it's also a way of sort of pointing to things that you're interested in yourself, like interesting artists, or interesting to sort of sharing that with the listener.
For me, like, inspiration always came from community.
Yeah.
More so from history. I mean, I feel like the information and the inspiration of history is sort of built in, and it's there to be utilized. It's almost like source materials. It's like the idea you're talking about collecting. It's like collecting records or collecting books. Right. It's just like it's this acknowledgement of like this kind of source material for your own experience. And I find it really sort of it's kind of palpable. It's kind of like this like living library in a way, and it's kind of more of like a it's kind of like objects of art. Like it's more about love than anything. But the idea of inspiration to me has always been about contemporary, shared contemporary artists and musicians on the scene. I mean, usually when we come in, for the years that Sonic Youth would tour around the world, I would always be like wanting to sort of ask promoters to ask certain bands to play with us in these towns, and they would invariably never hear of them. They're like, "Oh, they don't exist." Right. We want to get these guys. And I was like, "No, I want this musician to play with us." And it would be some basement noise musician, from from the suburbs. who did like one little cassette that was sent to me, and I thought was really kind of fantastic. And I was like, I want this person to play. And it was always really great. I mean, sometimes it wasn't, but this kid would show up like at sound check, and he had never even played live before, and he was playing in front of like 5,000 people, And it was just.
Do you also consider collecting as a sort of artistic project or part of your whole artistic?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I see it as the art of the library, and it's very personalized, and it's like it's curatorial. It has a lot to do with artistic ideas of collage and juxtaposition and identity. Yeah, certainly. Yeah.
Okay. And I guess there's quite a few people here tonight who would just, as a sort of closing word, would like to hear a few thoughts on a possible future of Sonic Youth.
Yeah, there's like I said, I never really sort of see finality in really anything as far as what goes on with just like exploration of doing music and art. So I would never say that there's any conclusion to a band like Sonic Youth. I mean, but at this point in my life, as we said, being 54 years old or whatever, I don't really know. I mean, I'll be surprised as you as what happens next.
Okay, I think that's a nice remark to end on, and I'm sure that we. Thank you. Yeah?
Thank you.
I'm sure we will all follow whatever happens in whatever context in the years to come. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. See you around.